Glad you can be here today. Let's get started. I'm Stephanie Savell. I'm the director of the Cost of War project here at the Watson School. Despite the somber topic, I'm really happy to be here today to have this conversation with this incredible group of panelists. This is being broadcast as well on Watson's YouTube channel, so welcome to our virtual audience. Over the past 15 years, the Cost of War project has illuminated the profound, often unseen costs of U.S. military operations, spanning their economic, human, social, political, and environmental impacts. We draw on the research of a network of over 70 scholars and experts at this point, 3 of whom are on this panel. For a long time, our primary focus was on the U.S. post 9/11 wars, but as we continue to follow the costs of war, we've expanded our focus to examine other topics, including U.S. support for Israel's post-October 7th war in Gaza, the cost of U.S. militarized rivalry with Russia and China, and the ongoing profiteering and political power of military corporations and their effect on the U.S. economy. Today, we're looking at the costs of war for U.S. democracy. In all the discussion of democratic backsliding in the U.S., there's a major factor that's often overlooked, and that's the role of U.S. wars and the constant state of preparation for war in this country. It's essential to understand how war and war preparedness, especially the post 9/11 wars, but also before that, the Cold War years, have had major anti-democratic impacts on U.S. politics, economy, and culture, including by fostering race and gender inequalities. Some of the things we've been talking about at Costs of War include the costs such as eroding respect for the rule of law, distorting the constitutional balance of power in favor of the executive branch. At the same time, massive federal spending on the Pentagon and military-related programs has increased wealth inequality in the U.S., squeezed out spending on domestic welfare programs, feeding a populist politics of anger and fear. Distorted federal spending has cemented political power for military corporations, leading to their outsized influence on U.S. government policy. War has amplified and intensified white supremacy and misogyny, and it's fueled social distress and anger among veterans. All of these costs of war are tied up with a lot of what we're seeing play out in the U.S. today. So here to tell us more about these and other costs are doctors Neta Crawford, Linda Bilmes, and Jenny Greenburg. Neta Crawford is a political scientist. She's co-founder of the Costs of War project. She's professor of international relations at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Dr. Crawford has served on the governing board of the Academic Council of the United Nations System and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Science in 2023. Dr. Crawford's work is on war, ethics, and climate change. She's author of The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, Charting the Rise and Fall of U.S. Military Emissions, among many, many other important books and publications. Linda Bilmes is an expert on budgeting and public finance. She is a professor and full-time faculty member at the Harvard Kennedy School and former assistant secretary and chief financial officer at the U.S. Department of Commerce. She has co-authored multiple books and book chapters, including the international bestseller, The $3 Trillion War, and she's written extensively on the costs of war, veterans issues, national parks, municipal budgeting, and financial topics. She's co-chair of Economists for Peace and Security and serves on the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration. Her forthcoming new book, The Ghost Budget, Paying for America's Wars, will be published by Cambridge University Press. And finally, Jennifer Greenburg, a feminist political geographer, is assistant professor of international relations at the University of Sheffield and an affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Her research examines the spatial politics of war, gender, and humanitarianism. She's author of At War with Women, Military Humanitarianism, and Imperial Feminism in an Era of Permanent War. So welcome to the panelists. And thank you very much for being here.
I'm Neta Crawford, just in case. It's always good to be back home to Brown, where I did my independent concentration, graduated class of 85. Yes, I'm that old. And who said I'm a child? You're just like 6 years older than me. And the war system and alternatives, my independent concentration was the war system and alternatives to militarism. Now, that tells you, I've been thinking about these issues for a very long time. And you'd think I'd be discouraged because not much seems to change, but I'm not. I'm very actually optimistic, and I'll get to that at the end. But right now I want to try to link two academic literatures. You actually stole a lot of my thunder there, but I'll just nevertheless proceed. That are often separate. The work on causes of democratic decline or backsliding, erosion, and the work on domestic consequences of war and military mobilization. So the literature on democracy and war in political science has long been affected by Immanuel Kant's notion that Republican states were less likely to make war on the argument that it was too easy for a king to make war, since they were insulated, these kings would be insulated from war's effects. So the argument was that democracy would make war less likely, republicanism in perpetual peace. Now that's what political science is paying attention to. Then they argue about whether or not democracies fight less or more than non-democracies. And then for a long time in the 1980s and 1990s, sociologists and political scientists were focused on the decline of authoritarianism. More recently, however, we've seen a reversal in that trend in what is now called backsliding, democratic backsliding, among new and even mature democracies. Social scientists such as Ellen Lust, Suzanne Mettler, Robert Lieberman, and Steph Haggard have noted several factors associated with backsliding, including increased economic inequality, political polarization, narrowing of the definition of political community, often reflected in nativist and racist policies, and the concentration of executive authority as other institutions, such as courts and legislatures, are weakened. Now, there's nothing new about a concern with democratic backsliding, in a sense. It's like 25 years old now. But even at the same time, Immanuel Kant was warning us that kings could make war at their pleasure because they just could run amok. This other guy, James Madison, around the same year, 1795, warned that of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Much later, this person who was sort of my intellectual grandfather, Harold Lasswell, in a 1941 article, articulated the possibility, quote, that we are moving toward a world of garrison states, a world in which specialists on violence are the most powerful group in society. He thought specialists on violence would permeate the civilian sphere, increasingly acquire the skills associated with civilian functions, mobilize the citizenry for military production and military service, and most perniciously, he thought, decrease civil liberties and sideline democratic processes. He warned that, quote, decisions will be more dictatorial than democratic, and institutional practices long connected with modern democracy will disappear. In a garrison state, he said, the symbols of democracy would remain, but the legislatures and voting would, quote, go out of use. And so he warned against the concentration of power that accompanies military mobilization. To militarize, he said, is to governmentalize. It is also to centralize. To centralize is to enhance the effective control of the executive over decisions, and thereby, he said, to reduce the control exercised by courts and legislatures. To centralize is to enhance the role of military in the allocation of national resources. Now, there's another view, and that is held by Aaron Friedberg. I think he's still at Princeton, who's argued that liberal democracy protects against the garrison state. And that despite predictions, for example, that the Cold War mobilization would lead to increased militarization of the economy and a decline in civil liberties in the U.S., the United States, he argued, in the post-Cold War era, did not, in fact, become a garrison state. So there's a debate. But in any case, what I want to talk about is the causal mechanisms. I'm sorry, I'm a political scientist. We talk about causal mechanisms, and A leads to B, X leads to Y. So let's think about that. But before I get there, I want to ask why it is that these questions aren't often put together. Why is it that we don't often put military and democracy together? And I'll just go back in time a bit. In 1864, U.S. General William Tecumseh Sherman told the mayor of Atlanta and the city council that he would destroy that city unless they surrendered. He said, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. You might as well appeal against the thunderstorm as against these terrible hardships of war." So this is the common view of war, that it is like thunder and lightning, bright enough to illuminate the night with a surge of electricity capable of cutting a 400-year-old tree in half and starting a forest fire. And then the storm ends. The war is over. Military doctrines also tend to emphasize the short term. They plan for and indeed sometimes promise a quick, decisive victory. The possibility of a prolonged engagement with all of its consequences is rarely imagined and planned for. For example, recall the German military doctrine in World War I and World War II, which emphasized lightning war. This was also the Russian doctrine when they invaded Ukraine. It would be over quickly, in weeks. And it was U.S. doctrine during the War of 1812, the Civil War, the war in the Philippines, and the 2003 Iraq War. This is also a large part of the doctrine of U.S. war with China. So there's an emphasis on short, effective, quick, and then what precedes and follows is not part of the equation. If war will be quick, decisive, cheap, and its results permanent, then we don't really need to think about the consequences and the causes. And this means that my discipline has not connected the consequences of mobilization, the long-term buildup to war, and the consequences of war to democracy, democratization, and I think the decline of democracy. So when you frame war as an event, an episode, you miss some of these causal connections. And that's part of what the Cost of War project has been about these many years, is to think about the causal connections, the long run. So if military doctrine needs to think more long-term about costs, risks, and benefits, I'm arguing, ought to enlarge our causal and temporal frame to understand these other consequences. So I'm suggesting that military mobilization and war have several consequences for democracy. And I'll just now do a commercial for a volume edited by myself and Matthew Evangelista. This is the current issue of Daedalus, which is a volume published, a journal published by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And what we did, Matt and I and others, was to gather many people to consider the many consequences of war over the long run for democracy. And Linda Bilmes has an article in it. But there are many interesting pieces in here should you want to explore these questions more deeply. But so what I'm suggesting today, just focusing on the most obvious one of them, is the concentration of power in the executive and the weakening of other institutions which check executive power. This happens because of arguments that it is just more efficient, or that others can't be trusted, or because the executive knows better. We need speed. We need precision. We need control. And if too many cooks are in the kitchen, we won't get all of that. Hence, one person can launch with cooperation, the United States nuclear arsenal. Speed, decisiveness. That's the thing. So martial law is the only extreme, is only the most extreme version of this concentration of power. We often assume that even when war is suspended, that when law is suspended in time of war, like martial law, this will be temporary. But as Mary Dudziak argues in Wartime, if wars don't end, the state of exception normalizes. So I'm going to use my favorite word about war. It is antipodal to democracy. It erodes the deliberation and the oversight that is necessary for the functioning of a democracy. War and constant fear of it can erode as well the cultural prerequisite of democracy. That is, as Professor Lutz has long argued, war destroys or weakens the capacity that we have to listen to each other, to engage in civil conversation. Democracy requires an agreement that we will resolve our disputes through deliberation and the rule of law. We take brute force off the table, and when force is used at all, it is governed by limits, by rules. And when it goes wrong, those who misuse their power are held to account. Then you've already mentioned this. When military spending increases, inequality tends to increase. Heidi Peltier has an article about that very question in this Daedalus volume. When nations are fearful, wars of aggression are justified not only because of past insults and injuries, but because of anticipated provocations. And these wars are reframed as defensive and preemptive. So at root of all of this is fear. Fear is the spark for war, and fear is the emotional lubricant for it. Fear reframed in less emotionally tinged language as national security is the ultimate grounds for the state of exception and the supposedly temporary loss of freedoms. Feelings of insecurity foster increased war spending, which redistributes wealth and increased economic inequality and polarization. Fear is one root of the inability to listen to others. So fear also reduces our capacity to think as clearly or as contextually as we might otherwise. Preoccupation with domestic threats such as inflation, unemployment, and violent crime are associated sometimes with right-wing attitudes. And related research suggests that right-wing authoritarianism originates from the belief that the social world is an inherently dangerous, unstable, unpredictable, and threatening place. Fear promotes the us versus them view of your place. The real citizen is one you can trust versus the folks you can't trust, the aliens, the sleepers, the terrorists. This dangerous worldview activates the motivational goal of ensuring security and stability through coercive maintenance of the traditional social order. Well, conservatism is not authoritarianism. When people are faced with traumatic system-threatening events, they tend to shift toward a more conservative ideology as a means of coping with uncertainty and threat. That's from the literature and psychology. And so this fear, this search for security, has the effect of narrowing and shutting down our capacity to see how current doctrine, military doctrine, and our choices about spending may or may not actually provide for security. And it also decreases our capacity to see if other forms of social organization could make us safe, other ways of being, other ways of dealing with the things that make us feel fearful. So, again, I'm a social scientist, and what I have described are some causal arrows, but they don't go just in one direction, say from war to democratic erosion. There is war, mobilization for war, increased inequality, increased polarization, increased concentration of power, democratic erosion, and then more war. As Robert Lifton says in his article here, the late Robert Lifton, war begets war. On the other hand, and here I'll conclude, I said, war is antipodal to democracy. Democracy is antipodal to war. It's the opposite. Increasing democracy can help us put the restraints on violence. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what does democracy look like? And that's a whole nother 10 hours, years worth of conversation about how democracy could work better and for whom. But the impulse to organize is often a response to war and violence at home and the abuse of power. And so this impulse to organize, to be in community, to resist, that is part of democracy. And I was asked to end this talk more positively. Where'd she go? Catherine, are you here? Okay, she's not here, but Catherine, where? Second row. No, Catherine Dunkelman. Yeah. Okay. No, so Catherine Dunkelman said, don't end this way, Anita. Say something positive. Well, I did see something positive. Actually, I was in Milwaukee this weekend, and I was in a bookstore, and I was told that just the night before, there had been a meeting across the street called by the aldermen, which filled a room with a 400 seat capacity, and then there were hundreds of people. Now, mind you, it's 12 degrees in Milwaukee at night. There are hundreds of people standing on the street, and what are they talking about? How they can peacefully resist ICE when it comes. So they're using their capacity to deliberate and to organize. They're enacting democracy in response to a militarized response to what we're being told is a threat from the outside. And as some of my colleagues from University of Minnesota put it, we can be very proud of ourselves when we act together and enact democracy. That's what it's about. All right. Hopefully that was more positive. So I can see her slow.
Okay, so I'm Linda Bilmes, and very pleased to see you. I started, especially to you students out there, this note to you. I started thinking about war costs about more than 20 years ago, about 2005, when it was a couple of years after the U.S. had invaded Iraq. And one of my students asked me how much it cost. How much was it costing the taxpayer? And when I looked around, I saw that no one was actually keeping track of this. Nobody could actually answer this question. And from that inquiry from my student, who I'm still in touch with today, I started working on it. This led to a lot of research. I published my initial research. I got an out-of-the-blue phone call from Joe Stiglitz saying, could he work with me, please? This is all. So he and I and the student who asked the question started working on this, and we have been working on it for many years as wars have become more expensive. And so I just want to start by saying how important this work is that Cost of War is doing here at Brown. I mean, it is really, really rare to find an organization like this that is devoted to peace and to trying to really understand what causes war and keep track of the cost of war and understand the dimensions of the cost of war. So big shout out to Brown University and to the Cost of War Project. I am going to talk to you today just a little snippet from my forthcoming book, The Ghost Budget. which is kind of Exhibit A of what Neta Crawford was talking about in terms of how war reduces oversight and reduces our sort of ability to see and to understand war costs. My focus is on budgetary and financial costs. There are many kinds of costs, but I'm going to talk to you about budgetary costs. So let me start. I usually walk around the classroom a lot, but I'm told that I have to stand here, so it doesn't feel normal. It's in my, but I will try and stand here. If I walk away, Stephanie, tell me to walk back. So let me first explain what a ghost budget is. So ghost budget is a term that I coined to describe how we pay for wars now. Not using usual budgets, but using what I call ghost budgets, which is really different from the way we used to pay for wars. So there is the decision to go to war, which involves a lot of different people. And then there's a second decision, which is how do we pay for the war? And throughout history, that second decision of how do we pay for the war has been a constraint on the first one, because countries have been constrained by the amount of resources that they could spend on war. And people have spent a great deal of time thinking about this issue, about how much money they can afford, and that has constrained many wars. So I am going to argue to you today and show you how what has happened since 2001 is that something has ruptured. And so we now no longer actually pay for wars, but wars are all being funded by these ghost budgets. When I say ghost budget, I'm referring to the combination of three phenomena. One is that since 2001, we have paid for war spending off budget. So the money has either been spent as an emergency, which it was for 10 years, even when we had 400 bases in Iraq. And emergency money is sort of by its nature, it's supposed to be for hurricanes and earthquakes and things like that, where what you want to do is get the money out really quickly. And you're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on tracking every penny because speed is critical. And so oversight is suspended. Now, we've paid for 10 years of wars entirely through an emergency. And for the last 15 years, we have paid through various kinds of exempt special budgetary vehicles, which are equally exempt from oversight. We have also funded the wars without any explicit discussion about any offsetting budget cuts, which is very different than what we used to do. And we have financed them entirely through debt. So that means that all of the money that has been spent in Iraq and Afghanistan and funding for Ukraine and funding for Israel and funding for Venezuela and every other military action that we've been engaged in since 2001 has been funded through borrowing, which is one of the reasons why, as you are no doubt aware, our national debt is now $37 trillion. The word ghost, by the way, is a really important word in thinking about the last 20 years of the U.S. waging wars. And if you read the Special Inspector General's reports or the Pentagon Inspector General reports or other reports by very knowledgeable persons, one of the things that stands out is that the word ghost is everywhere. And ghost as in, if I'm painting a school and I pay you a little extra to get me the contract, that's like corruption. And if I charge you 5 times as much as it should cost to pay for the school, that's profiteering. But if there is no school, and the money just goes and there's no school, or there's no police force, or there's no terrorist cell, that's a ghost spending. And this word has become routine. So that's why I refer to this phenomenon as ghost budgeting. Now, so when we talk about war costs, before we look at exactly what's happened in terms of the costs, I just want to emphasize the fact that wars have long-term costs, particularly paying the long-term human cost of paying for those who fight in them. My father was a World War II veteran. The peak year for paying veterans benefits for World War II veterans was in the 1980s. And for World War I, the peak year was 50 years after armistice. And in the Vietnam War, we paid, this is actually out of date, we paid $161 billion this year, $160 billion just in disability benefits and related health care payments to Vietnam veterans, and that number is still going up. And even the 1991 Gulf War, which was a short war, is costing $10 billion a year. And just sort of by contrast, I serve on the National Parks Board. The total national park budget is $3 billion a year. So we're spending like three plus national park budgets per year on disability benefits for Gulf War 1991 veterans. So the scale is really important to keep in mind. And just to point out how this is really hard to keep track of. Even a couple of years ago, when I, together with the Cost of War organization and led by Neta, estimated this $8 trillion total for the cost of war, of which there was $2.2 trillion for veterans. This number has now grown so that if you look in the financial statements of the United States just published, you can see this huge escalation and the actual liability, not for healthcare costs, but just for disability benefit payments for veterans, is now $7.3 trillion, of which about half is for the post 9/11 veterans. So there's this huge cost tail. So when we talk about war costs, we're talking about not just the current costs, but all of this, which is owed. We've already promised this money, and guess who gets to pay for it? All you young people out there, because we have transferred this to the next generation. Now, let me next move to the fact that how this ghost budgeting thing is really different from the way we used to pay for wars in the United States. In the budgeting, the financing, and the consequent transparency and oversight. So the budgeting, I think I already said that we've had these emergency appropriations and supplemental budgets and so forth. Just to kind of give you a visual picture, this goes back to 1950. You can see all those blue columns are regular budgeting. And you can see this. So the red is extra money that doesn't get any oversight, or very, very little. It doesn't go through the regular budgetary process, doesn't go through the regular Pentagon internal budgetary process. It's just like extra money that's like the hurricane money. So you can see there was a little bit of red there in 1951 for the Korean War, and a little bit during the Vietnam War period. But basically, there's just an ocean of red there representing 10, 20, 25% of the military budget ever since 2001. And so this whole elaborate process that we have, this legislative process for oversight, is just being avoided completely. And that's on the budgeting side. Now, secondly, on the financing side, the financing is really profoundly different because these wars after 2001 are the first time that we've paid for wars completely through debt. And you can see here, going back to the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, et cetera, we paid for all of these wars by raising taxes actually a lot and cutting the non-war budgets. But since 2001, we have actually not only have we not raised taxes, we have cut taxes 3 times. 4 if you count the most recent whatever it's called, the most recent Trump tax cuts, but just counting 2001, 2003, and 2017, that was 3 tax cuts. And we've not cut the non-war budget. But I think what is even more shocking is going back to the presidential archives and seeing how people thought about this. Because they not only thought about it very purposefully, but they really thought about having the taxes be progressive. So, and what it meant to fight and to pay. So here's President Wilson, World War I, talking about a conscription of wealth as well as a conscription of men. And President Roosevelt talking about how it was a privilege to pay taxes for the war. So people really felt it. You were either fighting or you were paying taxes. So top marginal tax rates in World War II were over 90%. So I mean, you felt it. I mean, Roosevelt extended the percentage of the population that was paying taxes to 85% of the population, which had mostly not paid taxes before. President Wilson introduced a corporate tax, which had never existed before. So they really thought about these issues. And during the Korean War, President Truman, who wanted to introduce a lot of domestic programs, gave up that dream in order to not incur debt. And he made 203 speeches about so-called, pay as you go, talking about taxation. He raised top marginal taxes to 92%. And he talked about these issues. We could try and escape the financial cost of defense by borrowing, but that would just transfer the cost to our children. Most of President Johnson's quotes are not really printable, but this is one of the more printable ones. I'm just going to grab my water bottle there. Not just because of Johnson, but yeah. I mean, he is full of talking about how is he going to do it? He wants to pay for his programs, and he's also got to pay for these effing wars. And when you go to the Johnson archives and you look through it, he spent his whole presidency trying to figure out how he can afford to have his domestic programs as well as the wars. The impact, even if you consider all of the issues around different tax brackets and state and local taxes and everything else, is that just to compare, somebody earning $300,000 equivalent would have been paying during Korea 71% top tax rates, 61% during Vietnam, and would have paid less after 20 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even though we had spent $8 trillion on these wars and incurred trillions of dollars of debt than they did at the beginning. So the question is, what are the implications of this in terms of oversight and transparency and how easy it is to have wars? So I will start by just saying that one of the consequences of the way we have paid for wars with ghost budgets is incredibly low transparency and low oversight. So when I say low transparency, it is low. I'll point you to fiscal year 2010 there, where the Department of Defense submitted 209 pages in its budget submission to Congress. As you can see, there was 23.5% of the budget was related to Iraq and Afghanistan and the wars, and 0 pages were explaining where that money went. This is just every single year looks kind of like these figures. It's just too many to fit on a page. When we look at the consequences in the legislative branch in Congress, one of the consequences of the fact that there were no taxes is that the fiscal committees, like the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, which are required to approve taxes, they didn't have to get engaged at all. So they spent a lot of time discussing these taxes during Korea and Vietnam, and hardly any in during the Iraq and Afghanistan years. This is actually the wrong slide. This is the Appropriations Committee, which also didn't spend very much time talking about the wars. And the Fiscal Committee chart is even more dramatic. But you can see during Vietnam, they spent 79% of their hearings talking about the cost of the war. And we spent here, 17%. So the legislature was sort of pulled out of the picture, and that has consequences for what journalists cover and what the public sees and thinks about. When we think about in the president's office, did we think about this in terms of the economy? No. You can see there that they spent during Korea 100% of the time, the Council of Economic Advisors, thinking about the impact of the cost of war, and a good amount of time during Vietnam, but hardly any time at all in the Council of Economic Advisors thinking about war costs during the 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan. And all of this is compounded by exceptionally poor accounting. I teach cost accounting at Harvard, and it is an extraordinary truth that not only do we have the ghost budget, but this is compounded by the fact that the Defense Department, which is now over $1 trillion, which is the title of Bill Hartung's new book. President Trump wants to increase it by 50%, and it cannot account for at least 40% of its assets. It literally cannot say where they went. It's flunked its audit every single year. And when you look at how we have paid for the Ukraine, $11 billion has been sent to Ukraine. And you have to, I think about these things and how we pay for it separately about whether we agree or sympathize with Ukraine. But in terms of accounting for our taxpayer money, $11 billion was literally sort of pulled out of the genie bottle by revaluing inventory. I have in the book a huge amount of research, interviews with practically everyone over the last 20 years who was involved in this about why this has happened, why we are now paying for wars using ghost budgets. It has to do with the economy, with low interest rates for a long time, with the generally dysfunctional budget process, and with a whole lot of reasons why it was super convenient for the military to do this. But I just end on some implications of it. First, the fact is that in addition to what is predicted in the literature, when you have low transparency, we have a lot of corruption, a lot of profiteering, and very weak discipline over where money is spent. Secondly, I would argue that we have reduced our civic engagement around thinking about wars because we are so divorced from the fact that they are so expensive. And we know from many, many studies, including an excellent book by Sarah Cripps, that if we pay taxes, we feel the pain. But if we incur debt, we don't as a society. And third, the fact that these bad habits, that sort of we got into these bad habits of ghost budgeting during Iraq and Afghanistan, have become the norm now. All the money we're spending in Venezuela, Israel, wherever, is all being done this way, like off budget, around budget, and whatever, using ghost budgeting, all borrowed. And we are therefore violating one of the most fundamental laws of war, first written by Kant, which is that it is much easier for wars to turn into perpetual wars if you borrow and don't feel the pain of paying for them. Thank you.
More slides.
Right. I'm Jenny Greenburg. So as my colleagues have spoken about this afternoon, there's a growing body of scholarship that really helps us reflect on the current moment of crisis that we're all living through, that asks how fighting and preparing for war can hollow out democratic institutions and weaken democratic norms. The costs of war for democracy have been measured against anti-democratic indicators, such as excessive executive authority, political polarization, increasing economic inequality, shrinking definitions of citizenship or political community, and I would add to these restrictions on information, including in the realm of knowledge production and at universities. The Costs of War Project has actually been providing information about these threats for the past 15 years. Research papers show how the post-9/11 national security state has expanded executive power, how post-9/11 war spending has transferred and concentrated wealth to a small number of military contractors, and how the category of terrorism is used to restrict who even has the right to have rights. A lot of costs of war work has provided nonpartisan empirical facts that break through popular myths about war and war making. Papers have shown how, after a military conflict ends, war's effects remain through the number of people displaced or who die as an indirect result of conflict, through the monetary costs U.S. taxpayers pay for borrowing for war and treating veterans' injuries. Yet something that we know considerably less about are the deeper societal reasons why in the United States, so much of war making is just taken for granted. This country spends more on its armed forces than any other country in the world, but this is not really a point of public debate or contention. Powerful but often taken for granted beliefs underpin the reality of permanent war and preparation for war that entail what Linda Bilmes calls a ghost budget, hidden from public accountability. So what I want to speak to you about today comes from a research project conducted in close collaboration with Costs of War on understanding and reimagining these beliefs about U.S. militarism. This project grew out of a desire to understand more about the assumptions Costs of War has long seen itself responding to. This study asks about the everyday, taken for granted beliefs that underpin the military-industrial complex. Without a clear understanding of what these beliefs are, it's difficult to meaningfully respond to what are often unspoken assumptions that enable permanent war. To learn more about these assumptions, a research collaboration I've been leading for the past 2 years asks where beliefs about militarism are rooted in everyday life and how these beliefs take shape under historically and geographically specific conditions. We asked how these beliefs are articulated through powerful tropes of nationalism, identity, and ideas about the U.S. in the world. The material I'm going to share today comes from the qualitative interview-based component of this research, which accompanies a media analysis and media reception study, as well as a forthcoming national poll. Through on-the-ground fieldwork that facilitated conversations within people's everyday lives, we learn not just what people think, information we might see in a standard public opinion poll, but why they think the way they do about war and militarism, where these beliefs are rooted, and how they stand in relation to questions of the economy, nation, and identity. So I want to transition now to sharing just 2 of the many insights we've learned from this study, which speak directly to the costs of war for democracy. First, on the military budget, a slide I'm now recycling from Linda's work, we asked a series of questions and interviews and focus groups about the Pentagon budget. And these conversations tended to confirm how little the general public thinks on kind of a day-to-day basis about the military budget, in part due to some of the ways this ghost budget functions and is allocated, but also that when invited to reflect on national priorities, many people were both interested to learn more and were surprised at just how high these numbers are. They also converge on a sense that military spending seemed kind of intuitively too high, but also an inevitable cost that we must pay to stay safe. When our research team presented information about the military budget, the words participants commonly used were too high, ridiculous, obscene, bloated, wasteful, and just wrong. But often in the same breath as these negative perceptions, people would often say, but we still need it to keep us safe. So here's an example from just down the road in Groton, Connecticut, which was one of our field sites and home to Electric Boat, which is a subsidiary of General Dynamics that makes submarines. Jay, a longtime resident of Groton, commented in a group discussion at the public library, "I think we need to have a military. I read not long ago that America spends more on its military than the next 10 major countries combined. I think it's very bloated, very politically run, rather than the core of the mission of what the military should be, defending America. But do I think we need the military? Yeah. Let's face it, it's not like anyone's going to be invading us anytime soon. It's more a matter of projecting power to help either our values, our national interest, or our allies." Jay's comment was in the context of a participatory budget activity in which we asked participants to rank how they would allocate federal spending according to their own priorities and then reflect on how this compares to reality. And like many participants, he prefaced any sort of reaction to military spending with a statement about how we need it. He then describes the high ratio and comparative amount the United States spends as bloated and not really about defense anymore. But you can see in his remarks, there's this underlying assumption that this is just an inevitable kind of existential cost. And this was an assumption that we heard more broadly, not only in company towns like Groton, but from software engineers in San Francisco to union organizers in Hawaii. And when reducing military spending was raised, we most commonly heard a concern that this would be dangerous. It could affect safety levels in America. But we also heard concern about individual military service members and their families, that any reduction to the Pentagon budget would negatively impact soldiers' salaries or their health care. And what's really striking about this reaction to reducing military spending as negatively impacting military service members themselves is that the invisibility of military contractors. Recent costs of war research by some of the folks who are joining us here today has shown that between 2020 and 24, 54% of the Pentagon's discretionary budget of $4.4 trillion went to military contractors. In the same period, just 5 weapons companies, including General Dynamics, although Lockheed tops this list, received $771 billion. More than twice as much money as the US government invested in international diplomacy and assistance. But to the public, this is invisible, how a massive share of the military budget goes to contractors. And where military contractors are visible is in relation to another taken for granted assumption we've uncovered through this research that military spending is good for the economy. Contractors have successfully dominated popular and media narratives about providing jobs, often on hyper-local levels that are really influential regardless of whether or not they are empirically accurate. So to bring this back to our discussion of public accountability, there's a massive wealth transfer to weapons manufacturers that is part of an anti-democratic concentration of wealth. And we need to make those linkages. Limited public knowledge about this also relates to questions of information access that are relevant to democratic backsliding. Transitioning now to how public perceptions of the military budget are colored by ideas of safety and security, we also conducted fieldwork in Hawaii, where, as you can see here, in 2021, the Navy leaked 19,000 gallons of jet fuel into the primary aquifer for the island of Oahu. This poisoned the water system for close to 100,000 people, for 93,000 people. Lainey was one person we interviewed who was made very sick by the fuel leaks. She still, to this day, suffers from vertigo and neurological issues. Her children have autoimmune diseases and neurological issues as well. She told us how after the fuel leak, her family had, as she describes, bouncing eyes, shaking eyes, ringing ears, bloody noses, burning throats, burning stomach, seeing stars, dimmed vision. The list goes on and on. Dizziness, vertigo, debilitating migraines, brain fog so severe I couldn't remember how to dial the phone to call the doctor. So when we interviewed her about 3 years after the initial onset of these symptoms, she showed us her daughter's lab reports, pointing out the chemicals associated with jet fuel. MTBE, that's gasoline. Flipping through another report from her younger daughter, she explained how the same amount is worse because she was so much smaller. Styrene and benzene. This is what causes leukemia. Percolate. This causes thyroid disorders. It's rocket fuel. I don't even know what some of these things are, like acromide, acrolein, organophosphates. Those are some of the most dangerous chemicals in the world. Why was all of this in her? Lainey was herself a veteran and a military spouse today, but she told our research team she would never allow her daughters to join the military because, in her words, they had already had a lifetime of toxic exposure. They cannot afford any more. I mean, I think we're all just kind of waiting for leukemia. So as sick as the Navy made Lainey, she also described how we need some form of defense. I also don't want to live in a country where a bomb is going to drop on us. Somehow we have to deter bad actors like North Korea and China, explaining how if you're going to have jets and warships, you have to put them somewhere. And a natural effect of this is the sort of militarized landscape that is very dramatic in a place like Hawaii. Lainey's military background might seem specific in how it orients her to think about the US and the world. But we heard this logic that we need the military to keep us safe much more broadly. Among other people poisoned by the fuel leak, general population of Hawaii, and our national sample. With some very important exceptions that speak to how, even as a dominant hegemonic view, this is contested in important ways. Both that contestation and the kind of contradiction that Lainey represents of someone made so sick by the military, but who felt so strongly that she needed it to keep her safe. These are also entry points to change dominant assumptions that bolster a broader political economy of war and militarism that we've talked about today. In the recent Daedalus piece that, to continue the advertisement for Neta here, one of the pieces of that written by Neta Crawford and Catherine Lutz, who's also with us here today, examines how the permanent condition of war and mobilization for war erodes democratic culture by inducing the fear Neta spoke about of military threat from elsewhere. This fear also entails a decline in empathy for others and a permissiveness that allows the government to exercise these centralized forms of authority in the name of keeping us safe. So this causal sense from Lainey that, of course, we need some form of defense is a certain rendition of this fear stoked through 20 years of war. But in closing, I also want to suggest that it signals a ratcheting up of what, since the Iraq War, many scholars have called a crisis of US hegemony that holds these deeper roots in the Vietnam War that we need to look at. And one of our broader research findings for this study, which is reflected in a companion media analysis, is this narrative of US hegemony or US power as existing under threat on the global stage. And alongside this threat narrative, we see the idea of military supremacy as protective against the complete disintegration of the position the US occupies in the world. And I think we see this in a lot of ways right now, which we can talk about, including, as someone referenced earlier, the official Pentagon budget surpassing a historic $1 trillion threshold, alongside these hyper-masculine, violent forms of politics that we're all living through today. Today, we're seeing the language of war, invasion, enemies, surge, and not only this language, but material actions associated with it turned inward. And I hope what I've laid out from the Understanding and Reimagining U.S. Beliefs about Militarism study sheds just a little bit of light on how deeply entrenched perceptions of military spending as good for the economy, without reckoning of what this spending really means and at what cost, and the notion that the military protects the United States from foreign threats. These assumptions form a component of the authoritarian terrain that we are all reckoning with now. Transforming these everyday beliefs into a more critical orientation toward militarism will be an important part of how the peace and disarmament movement counters fascism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a fantastic set of presentations. I am going to moderate a Q&A. So if you all have any questions, please raise your hand and I will come bring the microphone to you. I just want to ask a little bit more about, so I'm giving you a moment to think of some questions, but Jenny, I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about exactly what, like building on this theme of fear and, Neta's emphasis on how fear is so wrapped up with the erosion of democracy and with war, like these things go together and that emotional level. And you've just done this, incredible ethnography across the country of Americans talking about these sorts of issues. Like, how do you, what exactly do you see people's fears about? What kinds of things are they talking about? Is it like, I don't know how to get food on the table? Is it can you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the thing to really ask here is who gets to control the narrative about fear and what narratives receive uptake and are prominent and how people are making decisions and voting and understanding militarism in relation to these issues. So, I mean, we did hear kind of in some of the interviews in 2024 that were close to before Trump was elected the second time, right before the election, the way that narratives around fear that really were economic, that were about the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, hearing the way those were taken up kind of in the general population in a way that reflected what the way MAGA has attached that to immigration was real. And one question is how that maybe has changed today and evolved over time. But that's sort of just to say that who gets to control this narrative? Because we also spoke with plenty of people who the kind of fear and insecurity was about putting food on the table, was about losing their food stamps, being evicted from a trailer home. And there's not the same kind of national political narrative, I think, to grapple onto. And thinking about how the peace movement that we're part of here today is kind of speaking as part of this conversation can connect with that is a really important question.
It's really interesting.
I had a question for Jennifer. I'm curious if there's a limit that people have in terms of what they would accept from military spending, or is it theoretically 100% of the budget should just go to defense?
So, yeah, we did this participatory budget activity as part of the study where we asked people to imagine having $100 and then ranking how they would allocate funding according to their own priorities and then comparing it to reality. So we actually did hear a fair amount, especially in the Georgia field work, that there should be no limit on defense, that there's no, this is, and it really echoes the kind of ghost budget findings, I think, that Linda has found, that no one is what does that even mean? Because we haven't had limits. And so we're not feeling it. It's the way it's being allocated is this ghost way. So that definitely came up. But I would say that that's not the dominant view. Honestly, I think this is so abstract. I think actual numbers, trillions of dollars, what does that even mean? What is $1 trillion, Linda? It's you stack $100 bills to the moon back.
I always say that, million, billion, and trillion, they rhyme. like a million seconds ago is like last week, and a billion is like the year that The Lion King came out, like 30 years ago, and a trillion is back to when the woolly mammoths were walking around. So, I mean, it's really different order of magnitude, but they rhyme in English, so they sound the same.
It's really hard to wrap our heads around what these numbers mean. So again, I think that's a question for all of us of like how to convey the cost, and that's what Cost of War has done a really important job of conveying them in terms of injuries, of people displaced. Like the monetary costs are really hard, I think, to understand and grapple with.
All these documents. So you mentioned that 11 billion just like disappeared, and all this, the government, people in the government are affiliated with this money, just vanishing. Can you speak to why, especially in the past years, since we've seen this word used by the government almost extensively, why do you use the word ghost rather than say fraud?
I spent a lot. This is actually a really interesting question. I spend a lot of time reading up about ghosts, which before I started this research, I hadn't. Literature, poetry, whatever. But one of the ideas around the ghost is that it's like it's there, but it's not there. And then that's a lot of the way that people feel about all this spending, like it's there. And we've spent on a lot of expenditures where the thing that we've spent on is sort of there, but it's not there. The threat might not, in fact, be there, but we're sending a lot of helicopters into the middle of Helmand province because, what turns out to be like a ghost army was threatened to be there. I think the other reason is that Ghost Budget sounds like Ghostbusters, and we've seen the film, so it's more memorable. So a lot of people said, "Oh, like Ghost." So literally, there's a playful aspect of it, and also a very profound one. We're casting tonight. Casting tonight, Bill. You're looking for the Bill Murray. No, no, thank you. It is a really interesting question, but it's a lot more than fraud.
I wonder, there are so many elements to this problem of the relationship between war and democracy, and you've picked a particular important aspect or several important aspects of it. But I wonder if one or all of you can talk to the question of misogyny and racism or white supremacy and the forms of inequality that have fueled the authoritarian the moment that we're in now, and that has to do with these years of war preparation and war. In other words, whoever wants to take that question.
Can I just weigh in on that one? Wow. You asked, what are people afraid of? And I think that's very related to what you're asking, in the sense that I think people are afraid of China coming to take their stuff. And before, 30 years before that, it was Japan coming to take their stuff. And there doesn't seem to be any fear of Germans coming to take their stuff. There's a kind of sort of a racialized other out there, but then there's the white replacement theory at home, and the sort of masculinist ideology, which you write about in your own work. I think that it's all wrapped up. The masculinist ideology tells you how to respond to the people you're afraid of are going to take your stuff or replace you, and your language is the dominant language. And the other response to this is you asked, what are people afraid of? I think it depends on who you are, what you're afraid of. And a lot of women are afraid of these hypermasculine men, and the sort of brutality that seems to be rising. So I think it's an ideology that's not separable. I mean, it's all of a piece. So, but I'm sure there are better answers to that, which you could probably give yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just glad this is part of our discussion because it's a huge aspect of the authoritarian slide that is like the impetus for all of this, right? And of we know that war making entails production of gender in certain ways, and just looking at right now, if we look at the Secretary, not of Defense anymore, but of Secretary of War, the renaming of this department, Pete Hegseth, and a doctrine issued to all troops of having a warrior ethos now, this aggressive, hyper-masculine kind of orientation, and like potentially dialing back the integration of women into being able to have like equal access to all jobs in the armed services. There's so many different aspects of that just occurring within the Pentagon itself. That's just to give one small example. But I think like applied to the foreign policy space, there's a lot of that you can see in sort of how they're discussing the US and the world of like, we white men, Pete Hegseth, haven't been able to be men. We've been repressed by this woke ideology and these soft gender norms and whatever. And we're going to come out into the world and kidnap Venezuela's president, right? And do it in this quick, focused, the way, Nita, you described the myths around war making being precise and
right. Well, you can do it if they can't respond.
Right. So that masculinized foreign policy ideology is even, I think, playing out in important ways. And then you brought up race as well. I mean, during the post 9/11 wars, like Cost of Wars issued research on rising Islamophobia during that time and what that's meant, and the enemy making that we've talked about a little bit today of like the enemy within, who is included in the political community and who isn't. I mean, that's certainly all playing out around the war at home, like the military occupation of ICE in American cities. And that infrastructure was there too, right? There's like a legal apparatus that was developed during the post 9/11 wars that we're seeing used in a particular way right
now. I would just add that one way to think about it would be, we think about the financial value we put on safety when it comes to military, and how spending almost anything is worth the safety that we get from military. Just as a thought comparison, another thing that is very directly related to the safety of everybody in this room, and probably 100% will affect all of us within, say, the next 2 years, is the supply of nurses. And everybody knows that nurses are really important. And yet I think they are rated at the very top of the bad ratio of sort of amount of training versus how much they get paid. I mean, so there you have a traditionally feminine, there are a lot of male nurses like Alex Preddy, but you have a traditionally feminine source of safety, which is not really controversial. Everybody knows that we're not safe without enough nurses. And yet, no one is saying we should pay an infinite amount to nurses.
Yeah, those kinds of indirect but vast social systemic effects of the allocation of value across race and gender are just, that's a great example.
Can I just ask, or maybe we could all think about this together. I think that this administration's behavior and sort of, the gender stuff you're talking about by the Department of Defense, and I'll call it that until Congress changes the name, it's so extreme that we're going to think of that as, that's extreme. And whereas everything that you asked about, the gender norming, the sort of anti-trans, the homophobia, degrading of women in their roles has been unfolding for decades. So I just don't want us to be out of time, out of place, because this is so extreme. It is out of this world extreme and may get worse, but it's been long in coming. And that's why the causal mechanisms and the sort of interlocking of these different ideologies is so interesting. Like, so the gender and the race and the class implications of these ideologies is just, to me, in a stream that's been growing.
Staying on the topic of impunity, seeing the way that all of this is financed is really shocking. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about where there might be pressure points to make any changes. It feels like such a permanent shift. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the unghosting of budgets and if that's even an option.
Well, I love the phrase. When I think about the three major drivers, the budgetary dysfunction is getting worse, not better. The overall budgetary dysfunction and the amount of time being spent on short-term budgeting and shutdowns and almost shutdowns and that is a driver of this, because the Pentagon argues that they can't fight a war if they don't know if they're going to have a budget. So I don't see that being resolved immediately. The military convenience reasons are not going to go away either, because supplemental war funding money goes into much more flexible accounts. It enables the military to maintain its so-called golden ratio of keeping the Army, Navy, and Air Force happy, regardless, and getting the same amount of money, which has been going on since 1950. It is much, much easier for them to support the contractor because the funding through non-traditional budgetary methods is more flexible. It's very important now that whether it's 44% or even 35%, of the military goes to the private sector. So the only obvious point is on the economic side. So one of the reasons that it was so easy to borrow all of the money for so long was that interest rates were at historical lows. So you had for 15 years, after 2008, the government, since 2001, low interest rates, and after 2008, government could borrow for almost nothing. During a flight for safety after 2008, where everybody was buying U.S. bonds, U.S. commercial paper was trading at its, most highest volumes ever. And all of that meant that even after 20 odd years of war, we weren't seeing, in terms of the slice of the pie going to servicing interest on the debt, we weren't seeing the real effects in terms of how much we're paying on the interest. So that is the area where I see change. Certainly, both in terms of international demand for U.S. treasuries, potentially interest rates. If interest rates were at historical levels, it would be much, much harder to conceal this. And you see, countries like Denmark coming out and saying that they are going to reduce their holdings of U.S. treasuries. So I think that's probably the area where we could imagine forcing a change.
So I feel like in the last couple of years especially, but also broader in the last 25 years, the military has become such an extension of the executive branch. And I was wondering if any of you could ever see a future where this tie is not as strong and the military can be more separate from the executive branch and the president at the time.
You're talking about civil military relations, and right. So essentially, what you're asking is, does the military have a sort of independent capacity to resist, let's say, orders that are wrong or illegal? And then that's how I would take your question. And basically, from my perspective, I think they're holding. They're pretty independent, especially the last chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This president has tried to get rid of anybody in the Joint Chiefs of Staff who disagrees, and has called people back to DC and demoted them and threatened their pensions. But I think they're holding. So that's that we want, and I think it's in part due to their education. Officers get a training in two kinds of military ethics. One is a kind of, I guess it's sort of character ethics, and they get it at places like West Point and the war colleges, and then they also get an education in the law, and a lot of them believe in the rule of law. And so I, even though I may disagree on many things, like the plan for war with China, I'm not so keen on. I think that we can expect that this inculcation of these values and the rule of law is quite strong at the officer and general officer level. Lower levels, the military is a much more mixed bag underneath the officer level, and there's a high association between sort of right wing or more violent tendencies in the lower level. I think that's the kind of what you're asking about, right? So I don't say I trust that they will resist every unlawful order, but they'll resist many. And I also think there was a discussion in the first Trump administration about, and as there was during the Nixon administration, about if this guy calls you up in the middle of the night and says launch a nuclear weapon, don't think.
Oh yeah, that was definitely part of it. Yeah.
So, what is
Yeah, I mean, I feel like especially now you see the president has such power and able to do so much, and firing anyone who goes against him. And Congress seems very powerless and kind of behind the eight ball on it, and kind of not playing a huge role, and just he's kind of doing whatever he wants, and it feels a little scary right now.
Mm-hmm. If I could just say, I mean, first of all, I think you're articulating what a lot of us are feeling. The most direct control that Congress has over these issues is through its power of the purse. Mm-hmm. So when you look at how the Vietnam War came to an end, it was because Congress cut off the money. I mean, Congress just cut off the money, and that was it. And there were those writing their memoirs 25 years later who said, well, we would have won in Vietnam if Congress hadn't cut off the money, even though we had already lost 58,000 Americans and millions of Southeast Asians. So right now, the Congress is, in 1974, the budget laws, which had last been revised in 1921, actually shifted more power to Congress over the budget. However, putting 535 people in charge of a budget, turns out to have some problems as well. And the War Powers Act that was enacted at that time allows a president to do pretty much anything for the first 90 days and to create sort of facts on the ground. So until we can, in my view, restore more direct oversight over the money side of it and get them interested in it, that's like the easiest lever. And that's one of the many things that's been absent.
Oh, sorry.
Grabby. Bill's grabby.
Example of toxic connection.
I'll give it to you next. Thank you, all of you. I have a kind of a meta question about doing this kind of work as public scholar, something that I'm also really struggling with, which is I think you can see in public discourse, there can be something very mobilizing about being able to say, this is not who we are. Like, this is not who we are with invading Venezuela. This is not who we are with ICE occupying cities. And obviously, you know, if you know anything about history, there's deep irony to that, but it is also very mobilizing. So I wanted to ask sort of generally, how do you think about your work and kind of drawing public attention that partly involves drawing public attention to the continuities of history when it comes to this relationship between militarism and democracy in the US, without, you know, sort of deepening the public resignation that I know, Jenny, your work has also found, and like people's sense of helplessness to be able to shape what the state does.
Wow.
May I just take Bill's question, because we have to close soon. So let's just take another question and then you can respond.
Sorry about grabbing your mic. Well, people don't like to think of America as having a negative history, so that's part of the problem. We're also a declining power, and that's not going to change. And I think these folks are actually terrible imperialists. They're accelerating the decline, but they're doing such damage along the way. How do we get people to accept the idea that the U.S. doesn't have to dominate the world, and we have a constructive role to play as a country and as humanity, and kind of brush away some of these wraparound arguments about every dollar protects us, every weapon protects us, which are not at all in line with reality. That's maybe not a panel question. It's kind of big, but any thoughts at all would be helpful.
I'll give it a whirl first, or you want to? Okay. All right. It took me a minute there to wrap my head around your question. I'm not even sure I can answer it, but what I want to think about is back to fear. I think we're so, when we're fearful, what happens? So prefrontal cortex says, too much, I got to focus on threats. And right now, the Trump administration and even the Biden administration had us focused on China. They're coming. They're going to invade Taiwan. They say they want Taiwan by 2027. Now, they've never said, China's never said that, but they're getting us ready for that. That's coming out of the Indo-Pacific Command, right? This threat, it's coming. They're coming. And at the same time, previous Indo-Pacific commanders have said climate change is a real threat. I think people are just really afraid of the world going to hell in a handbasket, as we used to say when I was growing up in Wisconsin. It is going to hell in a handbasket. So what do? We have to decrease fear and increase connection. And everything that we do to decrease fear and increase connection will enable us to, I think, respond to the current and coming challenges. And building community, I'm going to use a 4-letter word here, love, is part of that. And, that may sound naive, but I'm old enough to know it's not. And it's very difficult to actually build community, and that's politics. And so I think building community is part of the antidote, as well as democracy, and community is democracy. So there you have it. That's me. I don't know how to answer you.
I'll just say quickly, that's a great question, Jessica, about how it's catalyzing for people to stand up and say, this isn't who we are, against ICE kidnapping their neighbors, for instance. And I guess, so I hear part of what's behind your question is like, this is exactly who we are. Policing came out of slave patrols, and we need to learn from that history. But I think looking at real, like where there's continuity and where there is a real shift happening is useful. And that sometimes in those stories that people love to tell about this isn't who we are, like people love, like, I think the group of people you're talking about loves like kind of the liberal narrative of Martin Luther King, but often his speaking out against the Vietnam War is left out of that. and critique of capitalism. So like there's often, even within the story of like, this is exactly who we are, there's still that catalyzing narrative. So I guess that's what I try to go to. Thanks for your question. Linda?
So I would just say to the younger people here in the room, I mean, this is really where you want to do your research. I was at the Economists for Peace and Security. I chair this organization called Economists for Peace and Security. And we have all of my board all have Nobel Prizes and whatever. But we every year go to the annual American Economic Association conference where there are like 7,000 economists. And they're working on topics that are largely very, very narrow, like very narrow. So this year we were in Philadelphia for this conference, and which was 4 days starting on January 2nd, which I remember because it's my birthday. And on January 3rd, we wake up and, this conference with hundreds and hundreds of conferences. And what had happened? The U.S. had gone into Venezuela overnight. And there we were in the first panel I was chairing, which was supposed to be about Latin America, talking about the sort of sub-implications of changing the special drawing rights, at the IMF to Argentina, whatever. And this huge thing had happened. And that's the only thing that anybody could talk about. All 7,000 economists. So, Jessica, we need more people to get involved in these topics. You guys who are here in Brown, you've got the Cost of War organization right here. There is a lot of work to be done.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you all for excellent panels.